Hello everyone, this is Jerry. For those tuning in, I'm a 38-year-old autistic man. Today I'm going to talk about something that many people have misconceptions about, and that is autistic masking. Before I begin to clarify, I'm not referring to the kind of masking some have done to not get themselves or others sick. I'm referring to what is called social camouflage, although it is more commonly just called masking. For those who are unfamiliar with masking or social camouflage, it's altering your behavior to mimic others to fit into whatever social circumstance you find yourself in. Society has numerous different rules, both written and unwritten, that vary depending on the circumstance and thus have different behavioral expectations for, again, different situations. Now, some people may ask, how does that make autistic people special? Doesn't everyone do that? Most people do mask to a certain extent because social rules and norms expect everyone to behave in a certain way in certain situations. What makes autistic people different is that some autistic people can't do this no matter what. Some might be able to do it for a very limited extent, and some, like me, can do it, but that this often comes with negative mental health consequences from doing it too much, such as depression, executive dysfunction, and burnout. Of course, burnout will likely get its own video at some point. But what makes autistic masking different is not that it, or even struggling with it, is unique to autistic people or even those with other neurological conditions, but that masking is far more difficult for autistic people than it is for neurotypicals, and the negative consequences of prolonged masking disproportionately affect autistic people. As I've said before, there are autistic people who can't do it at all, and some who can only do it to a limited extent, but that ability doesn't always necessarily come for free. What makes masking more difficult for autistic people is that it relies heavily on interpreting social cues and understanding social rules and norms, which is something that doesn't come naturally to autistic people due to impairments in the parts of the brain responsible for this. Because of these impairments, autistic people often require special therapies to be able to train our brains to be able to better interpret these cues and act on them accordingly, in addition to, of course, trial and error. Unfortunately, some autistic people don't have as much access to these therapies as they may need and must rely more on the latter. Simply put, autistic people have a reduced social intuition, which makes behaving in a manner deemed socially acceptable a much steeper learning curve. A major part of this training and trial and error is role playing various social scenarios and coming up with these go to social scripts that we pull up in our minds that we use as guides to respond to what situation we believe they're needed for. This isn't foolproof, as human beings tend to be fickle, complicated, and don't always function on logic and reason, but it's a necessary evil for us. A good example of this failing is an interaction I had with a customer at work once. I was ringing up a woman when she initiated a conversation by asking me if I was a father. I responded, no, I'm not, and the conversation, ended with her wishing me a happy Father's Day and me responding with, you too. Unfortunately, the customer misinterpreted this social script, which tended to work in nearly any other situation, as me somehow making a comment saying or implying that she was a man and didn't respond favorably. Now, I didn't get into trouble for what happened, thankfully, but it was still not a pleasant situation to be in. There are various situations where customers will ask, how are you? And when I must constantly remind myself that even if it's true in some cases that awful or bad aren't typically acceptable responses. During times of particularly high stress, anxiety, or sensory overload, my body language and tone of voice will sometimes cause my mask to slip off, in part or in whole, even if I do say my usual scripted phrases, oh, I'm doing okay, or I'm doing good, or, whatever, essentially. Even if this doesn't happen, having my focus split in so many directions at once can result in me not noticing certain social cues I normally would, which can result in unpleasant misunderstandings like the example I already gave and In some cases, one's perhaps even worse than that. During more extreme situations, I might have full-blown executive dysfunction, where tasks usually easy for me, like counting change, can seem more difficult due to the psychological overwhelm I'm feeling at the time. Less obvious but still relevant is the hyper-focus I must do, especially while in the check stands at work, to not go on sensory overload due to the environment around me being chaotic and sometimes noisy, and of course to minimize mistakes. This assembly line approach has resulted in me inadvertently coming across as cold and distant to customers. This, of course, is one of the many reasons why I'm glad I'm not in the check stands as often as I used to be at work. Of course, the high amount of masking I must do at work for these and other reasons are why my job is so thoroughly exhausting to me. If you're if you're autistic and in retail, I mean, don't stay any longer than you have to. Don't stay as long as I have. I mean, seriously. The good news is that I don't have much longer till I'm out. Now, while it's possible for some autistic people to learn to mask to the point where most people can't tell we're autistic, there are still, more subtle signs we give off that can sometimes be noticed by people. But most of these signs are usually not recognized as signs of autism by the general public because most of the general public knows very little about autism despite public knowledge, improving exponentially over the past few decades. Me, other autistic people, and neurotypicals who are more knowledgeable about autism may recognize these subtle signs, but the general public may mistake them for eccentricities, aloofness, or worse yet, rudeness, as I've discussed with this example I've given. I have a close friend who's also autistic who was forced to resign from his job years back due to a misunderstanding where a customer thought he was being rude. Through no fault of his own, he has a monotone voice, which was likely the reason the customer in question thought he was rude and complained to management about him. This is one of the main reasons why the unemployment rate among autistic adults is so appallingly high, though that topic, of course, is best explained more thoroughly in another video. To make matters worse, there are people in the autism community itself, as I've learned the hard way, who have misconceptions about masking as well. Some of them believe either masking doesn't exist at all, that it's, equivalent to something, ridiculous superstition, like it's, tarot reading or astrology of the sort. It's unscientific, garbage. Some believe it does exist and that most people do it, but that it's impossible for any autistic person to mask because it's impossible to suppress symptoms of a neurological disorder, according to them. Now, the autistic people who have these sentiments usually tend to be autistic people I mentioned earlier who can't mask at all or have a very limited ability to mask. Because of this, combined with the mistrust many of them have towards anything that may seem like neurodiversity theory to them, due in large part their concerns about things like self-diagnosis and the politicization of the autism community by bad actors, which I've mentioned in recent videos, has caused them to develop an empathy problem towards lower support needs autistic people like myself, which, again, I learned the hard way. Last October, when numerous people who I thought were my friends stabbed me in the back because I committed a heresy by mentioning my mental health struggles with masking. Of course, this has resulted in me going on a blocking spree on Twitter. Well, they call it X now, but I've always known Twitter, which is something I don't tend to do very often. But what they said was so profoundly inappropriate and hurtful that I just had no choice. And really, of course, it demonstrates this empathy problem that I mentioned within the autism community itself, and which I'll go into more detail about in another video. And it's a problem, to be fair, isn't just that segment of the autism community, but is also um, a lot of the ardent proponents of neurodiversity theory, which again, I've criticized their lack of empathy in recent videos. But this brings up the question of what we do about the masking, the challenges of it. Unfortunately, there are no easy answers to this, and what a good balancing act looks like is going to differ depending on the autistic person in question. There are reforms which can improve the situation. Neurodiversity proponents are correct that society encourages a degree of masking that is excessive due to society often confusing conformity for tact, but are incorrect that complete unmasking is the answer because some degree of masking is necessary to maintain tact. They are correct, though, that there are, in your own personal life, when you're in, with your close friends or family, that you need some, moments to, I guess, would selectively unmask. I should say selectively, on by situations, I mean. But the other extreme is incorrect. That concerns about the negative mental health impacts of excessive masking are little more than just another example of the victimhood politics of neurodiversity theory being inappropriately inserted into autism advocacy and research. Society can and should improve in its treatment and accommodation of autistic people in various ways, but no matter how much society improves, social skills will always be necessary to function in mainstream society. And while I don't have all the answers, I hope this video at least starts an important conversation and steers the discourse in a more positive direction.